Over the course of nearly 2 decades, fielding inquiries from journalists in the White House under 2 different presidents, at the State Department, on Capitol Hill, I probably fielded, and this is a very rough estimate, tens of thousands of questions from members of the press, which included fact checks, difficult questions, investigative questions, every flavor of question. Reporters have a responsibility, good ones, to ask for comment on a story they're working on. That's standard practice. And if officials choose not to comment on any given story, news outlets reserve the right to publish anyway. I mean, sometimes you miss a timeline offered if you are asked for a comment. Sometimes there isn't anything to offer. That's also happened. Sometimes you know that declining to comment sends its own message. And if you provide a comment that's not related to the story at hand, I mean, remember Stephen Chung and his merry band of MAGA spokespeople have a tendency to attack the questioner viciously rather than answer the question. Well, the media outlet isn't under any real obligation to include the unrelated comment. I mean, it's a judgment call, right? So it's no wonder that when CBS News editor-in-chief Bari Weiss forced 60 Minutes to pull a segment covering accusations of torture surrounding Trump's deportations on the partial basis that Trump officials were not given adequate space for comment, red flags shot up immediately. I mean, having been on the other sides of 60 Minutes inquiries or big stories they're working on before, and on the other side of thousands of other stories, often critical of the administration I was working in, I know how the process works. And that is not how the process should work. And of all the takes on the decision, it was the email Sharon Alfonsi, the veteran 60 Minutes correspondent who reported that segment, sent to her colleagues, that I felt really got to the heart of what should be chilling to everybody. According to the New York Times, Alfonsi wrote in a note to her colleagues, "Our story was screened 5 times and cleared by both CBS attorneys and standards and practices. It is factually correct. If the administration's refusal to participate becomes a valid reason to spike a story, we have effectively handed them a kill switch for any reporting they find inconvenient. We are trading 50 years of gold standard reputation for a single week of political quiet. That cannot be the bar, and it should not be the bar." And I say that as somebody who has spent most of my career on the other side of dealing with difficult questions. Joining me now is former ABC News senior national correspondent Terry Moran, author of Real Patriotism with Terry Moran on Substack, really excellent Substack. I have been really looking forward to talking to you about this. I mean, let me start with this. Your previous job, I think everybody watching probably knows, was senior national correspondent at ABC News. You've had a multi-decade career in journalism. When you found out about the 60 Minutes, I mean, I tune into 60 Minutes. I DVR it still sometimes.
Sure.
You know, I mean,
it's a great program.
It's a great program. When you found out about this, what was your initial reaction?
I was shocked. I couldn't actually believe it. And then when I saw Sharon Alfonsi's email, I was completely disheartened. My heart sank because I knew what it was. It was either a rookie editor-in-chief who didn't go to any of those 5 screenings. Look, when a news network does a big investigation like this, top brass is involved right all the way through the reporting and then the putting together of the story. They're screening it constantly. She didn't even show up. Then a few days before she shows up, she looks at it, she has a few comments, and the producers and writers and Sharon Alfonsi say, okay, we'll integrate your comments. It was the next day, all of a sudden, that she starts piling on these other suggestions, including an interview with Stephen Miller, and she provided Stephen Miller's personal phone contact information, and to change the word migrants in the story to deportees, which sounds to me like a Stephen Miller change. So she's got some questions that she must answer for that staff, who I'm sure is demoralized by this. Did Stephen Miller influence what she was saying? Well, you know, and why wasn't she doing the work when it counted? She wants to weigh in on these things. She's the editor-in-chief. She's got to get on the ball. But in general, it feels like this is a tremendous blow to one of the great American journalistic institutions.
As you know well, and people out there may or may not know, I mean, the timeline for a 60 Minutes piece, I mean, sometimes they'll do an interview with like a president when there's huge breaking news and it turns around quickly, but it's a process for weeks and weeks and weeks typically. So the timeline here of all of this seems incredibly questionable.
Yeah, she crashed it into it at the end and then tried to wrench it into a shape or at least provide certain things in there. Remember, this had already been researched, reported, written, produced, and screened, and then okayed by CBS's legal team, which is very strict, and their standards and practices and fact checkers, which are the best in the business. So it passed muster with everybody, but whoever got to Bari Weiss between Thursday and Friday.
Which we don't know. Maybe we will know. 60 Minutes reportedly did receive a statement from the White House, which said in part, and I sort of alluded to this a little bit, and this sort of being a judgment call in general, 60 Minutes should spend their time and energy amplifying the stories of angel parents whose innocent American children have tragically been murdered by vicious illegal aliens that President Trump are removing from the country. Now, this is not a direct response to the story itself. It's essentially an attack on the journalism. I mean, I guess they make a judgment call, but you're not, I mean, in my experience, you're not under an obligation to include an unrelated comment.
No, especially since they were invited to sit down for an interview and speak their piece to the American people about this story, which was the Venezuelans who were deported to a prison where they were tortured by, in that El Salvador prison. So it's a choice for the reporters. Do we want to include that kind of non-responsive, boilerplate, inflammatory language? I'd err on the side of sure, why not? They indict themselves in a way about the seriousness of how they're addressing the torture that these guys underwent at the hands of the El Salvadorans after they were shipped there by the administration. But still, what they really had was an opportunity to sit down and speak to the American people directly on this piece, and they decided not to.
And Bari Weiss could have said you have to include the comment, which wouldn't have been required, I guess, normally, but that wasn't even what satisfied it in order to get it on air.
Right. She wanted more of the perspective of the administration in there, which they had been invited to contribute to,
and they didn't
for months.
do.
Yes.
The bigger picture here, neither of us know unless you have some secret insight, and by all means share. I mean, there is a whole kind of Paramount situation here with, the ownership of CBS and them wanting to expand their empire, so to speak, and keeping Trump happy, and what influence that has on media reporting. How, I mean, as somebody who's been a veteran journalist, how do you see all of this and where this sits right now?
Well, this is creeping Orbanism, right?
Yeah.
Viktor Orban, who took over the media of Hungary in a similar way that Putin did in Russia, but not with soldiers and truncheons, but with cronies. He strips the media assets from one people or gets a sale, and he makes sure that his cronies get it, and then they lean on their own reporters. And it sounds to me like that is what's happening. At ABC, I've been told, I don't have any personal knowledge, but I've been told that the White House coverage is now being overseen by a Disney vice president, which was not the case, when I was covering the White House at ABC. This is essentially one of the challenges of corporate America under an administration that demands that the corporations, law firms, universities bend the knee to them, or their whole business, their whole life will be jeopardized. And that, I think, is what we're seeing. And that is an attack on the free press, basically.
No question. I have spent a lot of time traveling around the world as well, and it's important to remind people everybody doesn't have a free press like the United States. There is a bevy of people who work for the Kremlin following their leaders around. That's not what we want here. We need tough questioning. Thank you, Terry Moran.
You bet.
So much for being here.
It's been nearly 5 days since the deadline mandated by law for the Department of Justice to publish all files and materials related to accused sex trafficker Jeffrey Epstein. Instead, what has transpired is a slow, incomplete release. Some documents have had seemingly haphazard redactions, and some files have been removed altogether after being released. And in just the last hour, the Department of Justice announcing this: over 1 million more documents have just been uncovered. In a social media post, the DOJ goes on to add, quote, due to the mass volume of material, this process may take a few more weeks. The department will continue to fully comply with federal law and President Trump's direction to release the files. That follows a report from Axios saying that the administration expects at least another week of release and that there are still roughly 700,000 files remaining. That was, of course, before the DOJ made that post. Now, the department has known about the December 19th deadline since the Epstein Transparency Act was signed into law on November 19th. And some lawmakers are now accusing the Department of Justice and the White House of a cover-up. one of the authors of the law mandating the files released. Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna says the DOJ is ignoring the spirit of the law, and he and his Republican co-sponsor of that legislation, Thomas Massie, are prepared to do something about that.
What we are going to do is hold Pam Bondi in contempt, and she's going to have a $5,000 fine every day that those documents don't get released. We're getting Republican support for that. I think they thought this would go away because we're coming to Christmas and the holidays. Massie and I are not going to let it go away, but the country is not going to abandon these survivors.
Now, this morning, Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski joined 11 Senate Democrats in demanding that the DOJ Inspector General conduct an audit of the DOJ's failure to release the files. Now, in a letter to the Inspector General, the senators write in part, quote, given the administration's historic hostility to releasing the files, politicization of the Epstein case more broadly, and failure to comply with the Epstein Files Transparency Act, a neutral assessment of its compliance with its statutory disclosure requirements is essential. Joining us now, MS Now senior White House reporter Vaughn Hilliard, MS Now congressional reporter Michael Schnell, former state attorney for Palm Beach County Dave Ehrenberg. Vaughn, it's been 1 hour. I know what you're doing, and you're just scouring all of your sources, looking at what you're reporting, an additional 1 million documents. What have you learned since this came out an hour ago?
It's remarkable in terms of the scope and the fact that it is being acknowledged by the DOJ that these files from the Southern District of New York, which picked up the investigation into Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell back in 2019, and the FBI were both responsible for these documents. It is not clear how the Department of Justice over the course of the last 10 months and the better part of the last month, ever since this was passed into law by Congress and signed by President Trump, putting that Friday deadline into effect, as to how they were not aware, the main Department of Justice here in Washington, D.C., that they were not in possession of these documents. And this is as there was already a slow roll of release that pertained to the 10 co-conspirators, 7 whose names were redacted, in questions for the survivors, victims, and the American public about whether the assertions that have been made now by multiple Department of Justices about those who were in positions of power and associated with Jeffrey Epstein were held to account in the way that potentially the public would see fit. And now the fact that they are here on this Christmas Eve, 5 days after that Friday deadline, more than a month after it was signed into law, more than 10 months after Pam Bondi at the Department of Justice asserted that all criminal, that the investigation led to the appropriate criminal indictments, in this case, Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, and that there were other subjects that were not pertinent or were not deemed by the DOJ to have charges brought against them. I think in so many ways, the fact that the Department of Justice is acknowledging this is really calling into question for a great many across Washington and the country about what testaments have been made by the DOJ prior to today.
Oh, the host of questions that certainly are being asked right now is what you're saying, Vaughn. Dave, you know, just trying to make this practical for a moment. 1 million more documents, let's say they're 3 pages each. That's about 1,000 feet tall. Do you just open a door one day and you say, oh, there's 1 million more? How does this happen?
Government inefficiency is probably the most benign way to explain it, but this will just fuel more conspiracies in a controversy already overflowing with them. And it's further reason why the best approach is just to release everything with only the victim identifying information being redacted. Instead, we get this drip, drip, drip. It's a self-inflicted wound by the White House. It's got to be damaging President Trump politically. At the very least, it's damaging trust in our institutions, although that may be a lost cause at this point. You know, the Epstein survivors have been let down so many times over the years by prosecutors and politicians, and now these new releases confirmed that there were indeed co-conspirators in the crosshairs of federal prosecutors, but it dates all the way back to the George W. Bush administration, where the only 2 people ever charged with a crime here are Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell.
Michael, you heard what Ro Khanna was saying day by day. That's $5,000 more potentially for Pam Bondi. At least that's what he's pursuing here. Have you heard anything new on this development from lawmakers? And do reflect on what Ro Khanna was saying.
Yeah, well, Richard, we actually have a new statement out from Ro Khanna just within the last hour in response to that DOJ statement that they just got word of 1 million, maybe more documents. Ro Khanna saying that him and Thomas Massie will continue to keep this pressure on, writing, quote, after we said we were bringing contempt, the DOJ is now finding millions more documents to release. They need to release a 302 FBI statement and the emails on Epstein's computer. The Epstein class must go. Now, we're also hearing from senators as well. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer saying that on this Christmas Eve, the DOJ saying it has millions more documents to go through, calling that, quote, a cover up and saying justice delayed is justice denied. Release the files, follow the law. And of course, Richard, this just raises more questions of where were those files? As Vaughn mentioned, why wasn't the SDNY aware these were in its possession? How did Maine Justice not know about this? It's just raising more questions, and it basically means that we're going to continue talking about these Epstein files. The DOJ is saying it could take weeks more to go through these documents. Well, Ro Khanna and Thomas Massie, to your point of what you just mentioned before, Richard, they are still moving ahead with this inherent contempt charge. Essentially, if successful, and what's notable about inherent contempt, it only requires approval from the House. It doesn't need to go through the Senate, and it doesn't need President Trump's pen to be enacted. If inherent contempt passes in the House, that means Pam Bondi could face a $5,000 fine every single day that all of these files are not released. And it comes back to the idea that this bill that was first introduced over the summer took a while to get a floor vote, but was passed almost unanimously through both chambers of Congress. It said that all documents had to be released within 30 days. The fact of the matter is the DOJ has not done that, even more so now, saying it just learned of 1 million more documents. So certainly the frustration is continuing and mounting along lawmakers. And we're hearing enough from a number of them that they plan to turn this anger into action.
David, how big is the legal jeopardy here for Pam Bondi? You know, as Michael was laying out, the $5,000 per day personally Pam Bondi may have to pay. Is that correct? And this could be a very large amount, especially given the number of weeks, the number of lawyers that they may or may not have that they'll need to go through 1.7 million documents.
Richard, I'll believe it when I see it. This power of inherent criminal contempt has not been used by Congress in nearly 100 years. I'm not even sure it's constitutional. We'll see if the Supreme Court, which has given extreme deference to the executive branch, is going to allow this. They believe in the executive or the unitary executive theory. I can't imagine they're going to allow the legislative branch to start fining executive branch employees. So I don't think that's going anywhere. I think part of the problem, Richard, is that this act, the Epstein Transparency Act, is riddled with loopholes, and it does not have an enforcement mechanism. So Congress should have put an enforcement mechanism, a penalty in there. They did not. They created all these loopholes for national security and whether or not the documents are unclassified. They could withhold documents for existing criminal investigations. And so I think part of the problem is that Congress should have done a better job writing a tighter act here. So I don't believe they're eventually going to be able to use their inherent criminal contempt powers, but they can threaten and control all they want.
Vaughn, how has the White House responded so far? And this, given the Transparency Act was a bipartisan effort here, is there a worry from staffers, from the administration?
There's been silence from this White House here today. There was silence yesterday when we asked for a statement from the White House as it pertained to the release of the documents by the Department of Justice. The White House directed us to the Department of Justice's own social media posts, which have called the reporter a dope. Looks more like a defense lawyer for Donald Trump, calling the claims or the material related to him that was revealed to be untrue and sensationalism. The president posted today, Merry Christmas, but he is down at his Mar-a-Lago club in Florida. And we heard from him the other night on this front, where he shared sympathies for former President Bill Clinton and others who were appearing in the material release here, seemingly acknowledging that he, among others, were going to have more scrutiny placed upon them because of their prominence inside of these newly public documents.
You know, Michael, getting this Transparency Act passed took many, many cycles. There are some threats and saber rattling, as we've been talking about, coming from Khanna as well as Massie. Will they have the fortitude to come back to this and come together again? It was not easy to get to this point.
Yeah, I mean, look, Richard, this is all going to be a numbers game, right? It takes any bill in the House to pass. It takes 218 members. Now, one would think, considering the vote in the House for the Epstein Files Transparency Act was everyone in support except for just one member, 427 to 1, folks would think that this inherent contempt effort would sail through. But it's way murkier than that. On the Democratic side, Democrats have a very checkered history when it comes to inherent contempt. There have been examples in the past where they have looked into the idea of potentially using it for their own benefit, for their own issues. But then there was an example of just last year when Republicans tried to use it for then Attorney General Merrick Garland, and Democrats had slammed it, were up in arms over this idea, and really criticized the arcane and long dormant mechanism. On the Republican side, it's going to be a way murkier decision that they have to make, because you have Republicans who are very frustrated about the rollout of these Epstein files, who for years have been calling for these documents to be released. But then again, signing on to this inherent contempt effort would mean that they are directly rebuking a member of the Trump administration. And we know we just don't see that a lot of the time. I was talking to one House Republican earlier this week who said that the rollout puts them between a rock and a hard place. And then when you just talk about the idea of inherent contempt on its face, as was mentioned, this hasn't actually been successful since 1934. Almost a century ago. So it's a very arcane, as I mentioned, long dormant mechanism. So whether or not folks will want to get on board with this is an open question. But that all being said, Massie and Khanna still moving forward with this. They're drafting that resolution. It would be up to $5,000 a day for Pam Bondi that these documents are not released. They say they're going to go through with it, but the road to 218, that is going to be the big question in the House.
The blame game restarts again on this breaking news of over 1 million more potential Epstein documents to be released and uncovered just within the last hour. Thank you all, Vaughn Hilliard, Michael Schnell, and David Ehrenberg. Appreciate it.
A pulled 60-minute segment about migrants deported to a notorious Salvadorian prison under the Trump administration is now spreading online. The episode leaked after mistakenly appearing on a Canadian TV network streaming app. The 13-minute segment featured prisoners describing the torture and physical and sexual abuse they claim takes place inside that maximum security prison known as CCOT. 60 Minutes staff members, including the correspondent behind the piece, have criticized the network's editor-in-chief, Bari Weiss, for pulling the segment, with some alleging that the decision was made for political reasons. Joining us now, White House correspondent April Ryan, who is also the Washington bureau chief for Black Press USA and host of The Tea with April on Substack. Also joining us, Brendan Buck, former press secretary to former House Speaker John Boehner and an MS Now political analyst. Welcome into both of you. April, take us inside the impact something like this could have on a newsroom, making the controversial decision to cancel a segment at the last minute.
So the question is it the newsroom or the person in charge of the newsroom that's making this decision? As journalists, we are supposed to go in to do a story without fear or favor. Bari Weiss chose to not run this powerful, impacting segment, and she said she wanted to be neutral. But that segment offered so much. It offered the fact that there's torture from the very beginning of the moment that these migrants are deported to that CCOT prison that houses 40,000 people. The United Nations has criticized that facility, as well as the fact that only 3% of those migrants that were deported are criminals. Without fear or favor, Bari Weiss says she wants to be neutral in this, make a neutral story. This is what journalism is about. This piece was amazing, and it was backed with stats that came from Homeland Security, et cetera. So I don't understand Bari Weiss's journalism decision, or journalistic decision, if you will, but I do know that this piece is a piece of journalism history and journalism nuances that we need to hear.
And also, April, White House advisor Stephen Miller is demanding that there be consequences for the CBS staffer who criticized Weiss. Listen to this.
You have these 60-minute producers who are living in comfort and security in their West End condos, trying to make us feel sympathetic for these monsters? Under President Trump, we are not going to let little girls get raped and murdered anymore. And every one of those producers at 60 Minutes engaged in this revolt, fire them. Clean house, fire them. That's what I say, Charlie.
All right, what do comments like this say about the fear and concerns that news organizations might have when it comes to covering this administration?
This kind of mentality, this retaliatory behavior, this Trumpism when it comes to journalism, we already saw it. You know, threats and actual lawsuits of millions of dollars. This intimidation does not work in the face of the founding fathers. The free press, First Amendment. Hello, Stephen Miller. Hello, Donald Trump. Hello, the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt. This is a journalism 101 masterclass, if you will, for people who don't understand. This piece even went into what he said. Stephen Miller was talking about, these people were criminals, etc. Only 3%. According to your Homeland Security numbers. So Stephen Miller has to figure out, are we journalists, are we supposed to be sycophants like him with the president? Just lay the ground rules out, because the bottom line is this is a well-sourced journalistic piece that he is upset about, because it does not make this administration look good when it comes to the issue of migrants, and especially not just here in America, but at the UN and around the world.
Yeah, and it's not the first time he said something like this. Stephen Miller, a factory of unhinged sound bites, really. Brendan, this controversy comes as the president posted a new threat overnight, writing, quote, "If newscasts and their late night shows are almost 100% negative to President Trump, MAGA and the Republican Party, shouldn't their very valuable broadcast license be terminated? I say yes." How might comments like this be perceived by voters? Is there any indication they might think that Trump is infringing on our First Amendment rights?
Yeah, well, I think it's very clear at this point that he doesn't really believe in those same free expression rights that, frankly, conservatives for a long time have valued. I mean, as a Republican, we sort of always grew up with the Reagan-era backdrop of something called the Fairness Doctrine, which was the FCC trying to say that you need to have both sides, both arguments, and people like Ronald Reagan fought against that, saying the government should have no say in what the content of people's speech and even in news coverage. That's not the place of the government. Of course, Donald Trump doesn't think that way, and he has a very worldview that centers around him. If you are, say, mean things about him, you're bad, and now he's got this sort of power of the state behind him to pressure that. Now, what I'm encouraged by is there actually has been some pushback from people in Congress, including Republicans. Ted Cruz, a very conservative senator from Texas, has called out the FCC chairman for going down this road and buying into some of the threats that Donald Trump has made, saying that's inappropriate. We don't let the government choose what people can say or not on television within some basic decency standards. And so while Donald Trump has sort of laid out his ground here, I'm hopeful that Republicans are starting to see that this is not a wise path to go down, and we don't want to have the government in charge of our what goes over the airwaves.
Religious leaders in Massachusetts are spending this Christmas Eve making it clear they think President Trump's immigration crackdown is everything but merry and bright. Today, a group gathered outside an ICE facility in Burlington, holding a worship service to support the detainees inside. MS Now's Nnamdi Egwanwu is there for us. Nnamdi, what are you seeing?
Well, it's been a very busy morning outside of this ICE facility. It just finished snowing, so the crowd thinned out. But this morning, as you just played, there were hundreds of people gathering here to advocate for the many immigrants that they say are being currently housed in the facility behind me. They aim to do so through the retelling of the story of Jesus Christ's birth, which they framed as a story of a refugee whose parents had to flee their home to escape persecution and relied on the kindness of a stranger in order for Jesus to be born. Mary and Joseph had to. So they have drawn parallels between that story and the story they say of several migrants in this facility. I want to play for you my conversation with one faith leader who spoke about what he's been seeing from ICE and how that motivated him to come here this morning.
what ICE has done is it's terrorized, it's truly ripped apart family. And as such, what we want to do is represent that hope can exist even here, that even in the midst of hardship and opposition, there is a God who sees, and there is a God who is with his people, even when they're treated unjustly.
Now, Corey, several religious leaders I spoke to told me that they've been trying for months to actually have chaplain services inside of this facility, but they've been denied access. We saw a similar story today in Chicago where faith leaders attempted to organize a faith demonstration outside of the Broadview ICE facility and enter that facility, but were denied access as well.
Nnamdi Egwuonwu reporting for us from Burlington, Massachusetts. Nnamdi, thank you.